Spurius Postumius Albinus, Consul 110 BCE. Rome's dealings with Jugurtha, culminating in the Jugurthine War, by and large did not paint Rome or leading Romans in a positive light. No one, perhaps, was more damned by the Jugurthine War than Spurius Postumius Albinus, the second consul to lead men into Africa in order to apprehend and defeat the Numidian King Jugurtha. Postumius would outright end his life in exile due to his failure in this conflict, convicted of taking bribes from Jugurtha. While many Romans were accused of taking money from Jugurtha, Postumius was almost certainly the most prominent Roman who would end up being convicted of it. However, the historian Sallust doesn't seem to believe that Postumius was actually guilty of corruption. Rather, Sallust believes that Postumius was simply incompetent and unlucky. In this video, I'd like to explore the campaigns of Spurius Postumius Albinus and also his brother Aulus. Later, I'll do a separate video on Aulus since he did enough in this campaign to warrant his own video. And if Spurius is legitimately incompetent, then it must be said at the outset that his brother Aulus is legitimately record-breaking levels of incompetent. Spurius Postumius Albinus hailed from the patrician gens Postumia. Anytime you had a patrician name, your life was relatively good. That being said, the gens Postumia was not one of the more prominent patrician clans, but once you're a patrician, your name alone can give you enough prestige to always remain at least somewhat relevant in Roman politics. The Albinus branch, Albinus means something like whitish in English, was the most prominent branch of gens Postumia. Spurius's father was most likely the consul of 148, Spurius Postumius Albinus Magnus. Why he earned the name Magnus the Great is unclear, but he was not on the same level as someone like Pompey the Great from the next century. Spurius had a younger brother named Aulus, who we mentioned at the outset, and most likely, since Spurius would be consul the same year that Aulus held the praetorship, there was a 3-year age difference between the two brothers. We don't know anything about Postumius's early career. However, we do know that most likely he was quite excited when the lot decided that he would go to North Africa rather than his consular colleague. The possibility of fighting a war and winning the glory that it might bring, taking home the plunder that you might earn, was always exciting, and it was a way for any ambitious Roman nobleman to put his name into the pages of history. However, Albinus didn't know what he was getting himself into when he inherited the Jugurthine War. He wisely sought a political solution to the conflict by convincing Massiva, a grandson of the former Numidian ruler Massinissa, who ruled for an incredibly long time from 202 all the way to 148, to challenge Jugurtha for the throne. This would hopefully create a kind of civil war among the Numidians that the Romans could then participate in and capitalize on. Apparently, this was a strategy that occurred to Postumius while he was raising his men for the campaign. Despite his later reputation as someone who betrayed Rome's trust in a grievous manner, it's not altogether clear what Albinus's previous relationship and intentions were in regard to the Jugurthine War. Was he one of the senators who had been a friend to Jugurtha, or was he one of the men who, like Scaurus, had thought it contemptible that the Romans had been so obliging to this usurper? We simply don't know the answer. It's possible that Albinus's plan to promote Massiva to the kingship of Numidia reached Jugurtha before he had departed from Rome. At any rate, Jugurtha did not want a challenger to his throne, and he accordingly decided to dispatch his man Bomilcar to hire assassins to take out Missiva in Rome. Generally, Rome was not very heavily policed, if at all, and it would have been easy to sneak into the seedy underbelly to hire assassins. However, since the public as a whole tended to hate the Numidians at this point, it's likely that Bomilcar's ethnicity gave him away, and he was dragged to the forum and presented to Roman officials. Bomilcar was caught in the act of trying to recruit killers and then forced to testify in public, stating that he had been instructed to do so by King Jugurtha. Even at this late date, it is possible that the senators who were pro-Jugurtha were just waiting for popular anger to abate so that they could end this war and continue to take bribes from Jugurtha. Perhaps also they were deterred militarily by the sheer size of Numidia, something that I mentioned in my last video on Bestia. However, by this act, by attempting to commit murder in Rome and trying to murder someone that a Roman official had tried to bestow power upon, Jugurtha had effectively ended any chance of reconciliation between himself and the Romans. This was the final straw, and it ensured that the Jugurthine War would have to continue until Jugurtha was driven from power. And most likely this would entail the complete conquest of Numidia. Once he arrived in North Africa, Spurius Postumius Albinus proved himself to be a fairly typical consul in that his goal was to finish the war prior to the next election. It was his job to be present to preside over that election, and he thought that if he could come home victorious, that this would be the optimal outcome. Albinus, unlike his predecessor Bestia, was looking for a decisive field battle with Jugurtha or to accept the Numidian king's surrender. There was a distinct pattern that emerged and played itself out several times. Albinus would advance into Numidia, corner Jugurtha, and then be put off his guard by Jugurtha's offer to surrender. As they were negotiating, Jugurtha would claim that he feared Roman treachery and then break his word, launch a counterattack in order to restore the morale of his own men, and then retreat. The Romans would then pursue. The process would play out again. It was clear by the end of the year that Jugurtha had no intentions of surrendering and that he was playing Albinus for a fool. However, Albinus does not seem to have quite caught on, although I suspect his brother Aulus did. What happened, though, is that effectively no progress was made. Albinus was such a lethargic campaigner that back in Rome there were already accusations swirling that his inaction was caused by his being in league with Jugurtha, i.e. that Jugurtha was loading him down with bribes and that he was deliberately acting like such a bad general. We have no direct evidence, of course, that Albinus was accepting bribes or that this was any longer a viable option for any Roman senator, given the way the public felt. Having achieved virtually nothing, Albinus was forced to depart from Africa for Rome in order to oversee elections. This left his brother Aulus, the praetor, in charge. One assumes that Aulus had been with the army all along and that he had served as his brother's second-in-command from the outset. Aulus apparently was not content with seeing his older brother made a fool of, and rather than remaining in winter quarters as he was probably instructed, Aulus instead opted to march out and make a daring attempt to capture Jugurtha's treasury in a fortified town. That campaign I will detail more fully in my video on Aulus. Suffice it to say that Aulus chose a bad time to launch a campaign. Unlike many winters in North Africa, this one was actually harsh, and the campaign resulted in defeat. Jugurtha was able to capture all of Aulus's army, forcing him to surrender, and then forcing the entire Roman force to pass under the yoke, a fate the Romans had not really suffered since the Samnite Wars, something that was symbolically humiliating. Aulus was then forced to agree to a peace dictated by Jugurtha, which essentially said that the Romans should fuck off and leave Jugurtha in power in Numidia. This was not acceptable to the Roman Senate, and they did not want to have themselves humiliated. Even senators who may have been secret friends of Jugurtha could not have been happy at this outcome because it so fundamentally undermined the reputation of the Roman Senate, people, and army. When news arrived at Rome, Albinus was determined to get his brother Aulus's treaty submitted to the Senate, although he knew that they most likely wouldn't accept it. In the meantime, he decided that he would have to retrieve the situation in Africa, so he began to levy fresh Latin troops. It is telling that none of the troops he levied were full Roman citizens. He was planning to put the onus on Rome's allies, who couldn't retaliate at the polls. The Senate ended up rejecting Aulus's treaty, and it even showed its fury at the extended Albinus clan by refusing to allow the consul to take his fresh levies to Africa. When he arrived on the scene in Africa, Albinus found that his army was mostly intact, but that it was demoralized and that his brother had let discipline slip to the point that it didn't exist. This army was no threat to the Numidians in its current state, and the only thing that it was good for was terrorizing the locals through banditry, rape, and other crimes. Rather than renewing the campaign to retrieve his honor, the dejected consul Spurius Postumius Albinus only moved around his camp often enough to preserve sanitary conditions in that camp. At the end of his term, he duly handed his army over to his successor and then went home. Albinus's successor was the consul for 109, Metellus Numidicus, someone who would prove to be a far more capable commander. Unfortunately for Metellus Numidicus, his war effort would get off to a rough start, since he would inherit the army of Albinus, which Albinus had done very little to reorganize or get back into discipline. The tribune Gaius Mamilius Limitinus, in the meantime, had pushed the Lex Mamilia in order to prosecute senators who were guilty of taking bribes from Jugurtha. This was aimed at the nobility writ large, but especially at people whose incompetence or malfeasance was manifest. Most people in Rome decided that the failures of Albinus were not due to incompetence, but rather to malfeasance. Furthermore, most of the public, according to Sallust, were driven less by patriotic concern for the dignity of Rome and more just out of anger at the nobles for all of the abuses of the last 20 years. Therefore, they were looking to see some nobles made fools of in public. They were looking for some people to be made an example of. One potential target of this anger was Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, who most likely, as we mentioned in the last video on Bestia, had taken some bribes during the campaign of 111. However, he was able to use his influence and skill to become one of the 3 judges, therefore making himself immune to prosecution under the Lex Mamilia. The trials were harsh, based on hearsay and mob-like, according to Sallust. Albinus was easily convicted, although his exact punishment is unrecorded. If I had to guess, based on other incidents of Romans being prosecuted for similar crimes, most likely he was sentenced to exile and expelled from the Senate. The truth of the matter is very hard to establish, but Sallust very clearly implies that Albinus was not guilty of taking bribes from Jugurtha. He was just a bad general, and his brother was a worse one. If nothing else, Spurius Postumius Albinus is the polar opposite of Scipio Africanus. Scipio Africanus' success was largely predicated upon nepotism. One of his most important generals was his younger brother, and the other chief lieutenant for Scipio Africanus was his best friend. Nepotism often paid off in Roman history, but for Spurius Postumius Albinus, it had the exact opposite impact. He died in exile because of his brother's incompetence. In no uncertain terms, Aulus was the reason that Spurius Albinus was convicted and exiled. However, beyond the personal sufferings of a mediocre at best consul, there are larger lessons here. The incompetence of the Albinus brothers effectively ensured that the Jugurthine War, which always had the potential to turn into a quagmire, evolved into the Republic's Vietnam. Much like Vietnam, this protracted conflict exposed the depth of the Senate's corruption, the ineptitude of some of its leaders, especially militarily, and the declining quality of Rome's levied legions. The Roman Senate began to realize that the legions that it was levying were not of the same quality as the ones of earlier in the century, which had a large number of veterans from the Second Punic War and were virtually unbeatable. These new levies were of a much lower quality. Something needed to be done. As for Albinus' successor Metellus Numidicus, here was an opportunity to prove his military chops. This war had to be fought to a conclusion now, and Metellus Numidicus was just the man to come up with a strategy for doing so. However, he would be replaced by his protege/rival Gaius Marius, who would then use this conflict as a springboard to great fame, and he would also go on to, of course, reform the Roman military. While Marius's reforms were directly in response to the Gallic invasions in the north, one can't help but think that it was as early as 110 when the real cracks in the system showed, when a Roman army was forced to be placed under a yoke by a client kingdom. Another figure who would emerge from the wreckage of Albinus's career was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose coin is pictured here. Sulla, as a young quaestor, was ultimately able to secure the capture of Jugurtha, and this would really become his first claim to fame and the thing that would launch a career which would culminate in a dictatorship. What I'm saying is that without the incompetence of the Albinus brothers, perhaps neither Marius nor Sulla would have risen to great prominence. Such are the contingencies of history. Never underestimate the power of a little bit of stupidity. It can go a long way. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.